Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to almost a graveyard shift. I want to talk to you about constructions of journalistic legitimacy and popularity in the sports press just before the Great War. Now, most of you have no doubt already used late 19th, early 20th century sports papers in your own research. However, I think that our understanding of the sports press not always takes into account how it was really part and parcel to the broader cultural history of present journalism of the period. Now, the late 19th century was a sort of golden age for the press in Europe because of increased literacy rates, the abolition of paper taxes, and advances in printing technology. And from the 1880s on especially, the number of newspapers as well as their circulation numbers rose. A growing number of specialist publications appeared, including sports papers, and journalism became much more professionalized. Now, because of all of this, the ideas and defining practices of journalism took on new shape as well. This was also true for the sports press, where this dynamic was further compounded by the development of the sports sector itself. Now, what this paper wants to do is analyze how one sports paper, the Belgian Dutch language journal Sportwereld, presented itself to its readers just before the First World War. Now, in the equally expanding Belgian press landscape, sports titles have first gained a foothold in the 1890s, when cycling sport had its first popularity boom. Although soon after 1900, sports as well as general papers also featured sports like football or boxing. Significantly, while most early sports papers were printed in French, the later 1900s also witnessed the growth of a Dutch language or Flemish sports press in the bilingual country that is Belgium. Especially between 1908 and 1910, with papers appearing like the Sportman, the Sportblad, or Sportvriend. They were not particularly original in their naming. All these papers appearing in these years. Now, on the 12th of September 1912, Sportwereld joined this growing cohort. Just like its colleagues, it's focused mostly on cycling as Belgium's most popular sport, but also included sections on football or on boxing. Now, before 1914 already, Sportwereld would overpower its competitors to become the leading Flemish sports paper. So, given its success, it offers a real good case study of the norms and values its contributors deemed important in sports reporting, and how they saw the sports press, the social role of the sports press. Now, in order to do this, I undertook a critical reading of Sportwereld's first 254 issues, published between September 1912 and August 1914 when war broke out, which were all digitized by Belgium's Royal Library. And to tease out elements of importance, I used keyword searches based on a review of literature on present journalism history. Now, some of these keywords related to the terms used for a journalist, such as reporter, others to journalistic practices, such as telegraph, copy, telegram, while still others to values of reporting, such as truth or objectivity. Now, all this resulted in 154 relevant articles. So, let's take a look at what those results tell us about how a paper like Sportwereld presented itself to its readers, what norms, what values its contributors deemed important in journalistic practice, and how they used these to position the paper in the market. Now, first of all, Sportwereld presented itself as informing its readers of everything noteworthy that was happening in sports. And to back up this claim, it emphasized how its reporters were serious newspapermen who went wherever the action was. It consistently mentioned, for instance, how one or more of them were present at big football matches or at big cycling events throughout the country. Now, to be sure, like most Belgian sports titles of the time, Sportwereld had only a small team of core contributors, of whom few, like its director, Leon van den Houten, or its editor-in-chief, Karel van Wijnendale, worked full-time as journalists. However, a much larger group of part-time correspondents supported them. And Sportwereld continuously stressed how it was the only paper in Flanders with a correspondent in every Flemish town allowing it to include a broad range of regional sporting news. Indeed, the paper even boasted correspondence in foreign cities like Berlin or Paris. Now, not only were Sportwereld's reporters said to be present everywhere sports were played, what was much more important was the claim of the paper that these reporters observed everything there with expert eyes, that they were able to understand and interpret what was happening and what this meant. So having experience in sporting matters thus was an important argument in claiming legitimacy for the paper. And already in its first issue, the extensive sporting experience of its key contributors was given much prominence on its front page. And this really remained a regular tactic, especially editor-in-chief van Wijnendale. His expertise in cycling was often highlighted. In January 1914, for instance, an announcement that he would personally report on the Paris 6 days race stated that he, and I quote, with his expert eye, will notice more than one detail that would escape other untrained ones, end of quote. Now, such claims, of course, had some truth to them, as Sportwereld's contributors were indeed often well-versed in their sport of choice. Van Wijnendale, for instance, had been a cyclist himself and was involved in managing both cycling tracks and individual races. Now, by highlighting its journalist's experience, the paper's reports received an aura of trustworthiness. And I think the latter term brings us to two core values, journalistic values in Sportwereld: truthfulness and impartiality. Now, in all kinds of articles, Sportwereld's journalists emphasized how they were impartial observers, who printed only the truth, not holding back for anything or anyone. For instance, when criticizing the subpar performances of a number of popular Belgian cyclists in 1914, Van Wijnendale stated how, I quote again, "I am not in the habit of hesitating before the truth," end of quote. Now, similar sentiments were echoed in his colleagues' reports on football matches or on boxing events. And although it seems evident nowadays, this journalistic ideal of being truthful was and indeed remains a difficult one, especially in the sports press, where, for instance, journalists' personal commercial interests in sport, in the sports industry, could call their impartiality into question. Indeed, as I just mentioned, Sportwereld used the involvement of its reporters in the sports industry as a claim to authority itself. So conspicuously stating it printed only impartial truths had to offset such potential criticisms. Now, while Sportwereld greatly stressed the quality of its reporters and their impartiality, all this was matched with an element that was even more crucial to the paper, that of speed. So the introduction of the telegraph in the early and the telephone in the late 19th century had made timely reporting essential to the press, as the paper, to first publish a given story, had a key advantage over its competitors. And this certainly rang true for sports, as getting match results to the public first guaranteed higher sales. Now, and I think the fictional conversation on this For this reason, Sportwereld proudly reported on every instance in which the paper had managed to provide news to its readers at a very short notice. In June 1913, for instance, it featured a spontaneous letter of a group of readers who praised the paper for providing them with the results of the Paris-Roubaix cycle race only 28 minutes after it had finished. While another example, in March 1914, the paper boasted of how it had distributed a partial report on its own Tour of Flanders race only minutes after it had ended, claiming to have set a record, and I quote, in American style, thus referring to American journalism as the originator of this kind of speedy reporting. Now, Sportwereld was founded in a period in which sports news was on the rise in both general and specialist papers. So distinguishing itself from its competitors was always a concern. However, this also allowed it to emphasize the values I just reviewed, the quality of its own sports journalism by contrasting it with its rivals' practices. And especially its conflict with the paper Sportwereld, founded in 1909, was highly instructive in this regard. Both papers vied for the same readers, with especially Sportwereld fearing the loss of its strong position on the market to the newcomer. And for the director of Sportwereld, things were also very personal, since several of his key reporters had left the paper to go work at Sportwereld. So for all these reasons, both papers engaged in a months-long battle from early 1913 on. And this was a battle in which satire was often used. So Sportwereld, for instance, ridiculed Sportwereld in a lengthy front-page report of an entirely made-up cycling race, the 6 days race of Izegem, named after the town where Sportwereld was printed. So humor, but also at times things got a lot more vicious with personal attacks on reporters' reputation and personal lives from both sides. Now, in both cases, Sportwereld constantly jabbed at what is presented as the failing journalistic values of Sportwereld and its contributors. The latter was laughed at, for instance, for having a limited network of journalists, especially when it was discovered that one of its most prolific contributors used up to 4 different pseudonyms at a time just to give the impression that the paper was well staffed. Those who did actually work at the paper were considered to be lacking in expertise in critical faculties, having taken up sports reporting not as a serious pursuit, but as just to gain some money or just on a whim. Hence, Sportwereld claimed Sportwereld seldom had good eyewitness accounts, but relied on copying information from other papers through the practice of what it called scissors and glue. Because of this, another argument, Sportwereld also failed to provide speedy reports of matches or races. And even if it did manage to provide a report, it was often bursting with inaccuracies. Sportwereld even gleefully mocked the manufactural errors made by one of Sportwereld's fixed contributors by nicknaming him Tone de Schieter, which translates as Tommy Misfire. So these are all arguments used by Sportwereld against Sportwereld, and you can really see the contrast between Sportwereld's own supposed good practices and the bad practices of its competitor. Now, so far I've talked about how Sportwereld presented itself in terms of journalistic norms and values. However, all these were in some way related to what the paper saw as its overarching mission. And this mission was, in short, described as fulfilling its duty towards the public. Now, this is an important term, duty. The paper referred to this duty, at all moments, and by linking it often with the journalistic values it claimed to stand for. Providing speedy, accurate information, for instance, had to serve a public supposedly craving news of races and matches, while being impartial, being truthful, was necessary because the public had a right, so the paper claimed, to be fully informed. Moreover, duty was also understood as correctly guarding the opinion of the public by, for instance, holding a referendum on which players should be included in Belgium's national football team, as the paper did in 1914. But it also extended to the inclusion of, for instance, readers' letters in the paper, so that they, the readers, could have their say on certain matters. And in this sense, Sportwereld presented itself as the voice or the champion of the people, as much as a source of information. Hence, publishing sports news also became a sort of social commitment, which gave the paper a kind of moral legitimacy. And as such, the paper closely matched the central tenets of the so-called representative ideal that journalism historian Mark Hampton identified as making headway in journalism since the 1880s. Now, earlier, newspapers had been mostly aimed at a limited upper-class readership and were dominated by an older so-called educational ideal, which saw the press mainly as a tool for political and social education in civil society. With the growth of the press in late 19th century, however, the idea that this press should reflect, rather than direct, public opinion opened the door to a more popular and at times sensational style of journalism aimed at a mass public, which gave more room to topics such as gossip, crime news, and indeed sports news. Now, categorizing Sportwereld's discourse as self-representation in this way is especially relevant when we compare it with most other Belgian newspapers of the time, which remained strongly affiliated to political parties, and in which political influencing of its readership played a central role. However, while Sportwereld's conception of journalism perhaps corresponded more to that of the English tabloids of the time, it wasn't entirely free of social or political opinionating. Sportwereld, in its own words, and I quote, wanted to give the people sport, but also food for its mental development. Thus, it wanted to represent, but also improve or indeed educate its readers. So, not only was the paper a strong believer in sport as a force for mental, physical, and social improvement, as most sports papers of the period were, its core contributors, like editor-in-chief Karel van Wijnendalen, for instance, they were also united in their striving towards the social-cultural empowerment of Belgium's underprivileged, largely underprivileged, Dutch-speaking Flemish population. So, although it claimed absolute political neutrality, this, in fact, associated its journalists with a growing social-political, so-called Flemish movement in the country, which really had the same goals. Now, both elements, of course, clearly resonated in the paper's discourse. For instance, in the advice it gave its readers not to jeer or boo at athletes while attending sports events, as a sort of attempt at morally educating them, but also in the paper's claim of defending Flemish racist interests against the Belgian Cycling Association, which was mostly dominated by a French-speaking elite. But also, for instance, by including moralizing short stories on its pages. Now, Sportwereld saw no problem in combining this more moralizing or educational outlook with its claims to being representative, with its claims to journalistic integrity. Although claiming to be objective, it also proclaimed that it's, again the word, duty to support Flemish athletes to the fullest. And while a discourse of Flemish pride, a Flemish identity construction, was consistently present in reports, especially in cycling, Sportwereld always denied that this meant the paper was being chauvinistic or not being objective. So, for instance, when criticism was leveled at the paper because of its over-enthusiastic coverage of the Flemish rider Marcel Buyse in the 1930 Tour de France, the paper responded by citing at length the positive reception of the same cyclist in foreign papers, most notably in the French paper L'Auto, thus implying that it couldn't be biased if even the notoriously chauvinistic French praised him. So in this way, these ideals of journalistic integrity, of representative ambitions and of educational ambitions often were successfully intertwined in the paper. Now, finally, claiming a status as a legitimate journalistic enterprise that was serving the public was one thing, but to really give weight to such claims, Sportwereld also needed to show its readers that its formula was indeed successful. And this it did by conspicuously including references to its actual and, of course, according to the paper, unequivocally positive reception among its readers. So, reading the paper, one was constantly assailed by stories of how its journalists were being cheered on at cycling races, how the paper's salesmen couldn't keep up with demands for the paper, how even Flemish expatriates in the United States still wanted to continue receiving the paper in their new homes, or especially of how its circulation numbers were on the rise, especially on occasion of big events like the Tour de France, for instance. The paper triumphantly claimed a daily circulation running into the tens of thousands, although this was probably an exaggerated number. Its main rival, Sportwereld, on the other hand, was laughed at because of its declining circulation, something which was true. Crucially, and finally, Sportwereld interpreted all these signs of success, whether they were true or not, as not just illustrating its popularity, but illustrating how it was being trusted by its readers, how it had the trust of its readers. And as trust resonates more than popularity, Sportwereld could thus convincingly vindicate its claim of reflecting what the people wanted. So, in conclusion, this case study has attempted to tease out a number of underlying assumptions of veracity and legitimacy in sports journalism at an important moment in the latter's development in Belgium. Of course, more work is needed to fully explain their development, their evolution in Belgium and European context. Thank you.